about defending the faith and engaging with people, if nothing else, one of the most important things would be knowing things maybe I don't want to do and not doing those. Because they're the kind of things that maybe we start rethinking and questioning, oh, I wish I didn't do that, after the fact. And so that's where I hope it can be helpful. When we think about defending the faith, it doesn't take long to realize there's multiple stages to actually develop an effectiveness in this ability to engage, where you feel like I'm not doing this very well, maybe right off the bat. And as you start doing it, that might change. So it doesn't take long to start realizing there's a lot more to this than just talking to somebody. So what I want to do is look at the different stages to start out, and I'm identifying 4 of them. We're only going to talk about 1, but there's 4. So the first one you see is understanding the specific evidence and arguments for Christianity, as well as significant points or distinctions you want to make. Well, this right there can seem pretty daunting, because this is this vast subject. Like, there's so many categories, and I can think of so many questions off the top of my head, and I know that people are going to ask me ones I'm not even thinking of. And there's so much to navigate. There's an aspect of making the case for why you believe things. And then there's the aspect of responding to specific objections that people are throwing at you that you don't have any control over when it comes at you. And they might be completely opposed to your position, not just asking a question, but opposing it. So there's the two aspects on this one is what we might refer to as offensive apologetics and defensive apologetics, where I'm trying to make a case. This has been referred to a little bit this weekend, but I'm trying to make the case, and so I'm presenting my idea, and that would often be like in regards to inquiry, or if I was sharing the gospel, it might be by making a case. But then there's also defensive, where maybe it's hard questions, or maybe it's attacks, where people are really trying to come after us. Now, if they're doing that, one thing I will note: I might not be trying to help them. Right? I might be responding to that because I'm hoping, and some other people listening, other people I want to kind of see the response and kind of see how it could be handled, as opposed to thinking I'm going to change the mind of the person that's attacking me. Second one, being able to recall the points and the reasoning as you encounter questions that arise with those who are on the same team in this one. Meaning, friendly fire. Maybe it's family. Maybe it's people that you have discussions with a lot, But now having recall during those kind of opportunities where you're discussing your faith, maybe it's people they're not even wondering. You're just discussing it because it's of interest, and so you have more to contribute to those kind of conversations. Whether they're not challenging so much as they are, so I'm trying to recall things. Right? So with these two, like the first one is simply this familiarity and understanding like the purpose of ideas. And the second level is the actual recall when things come up, like on the spot, not a email, get back to me, write out an answer, but on the spot kind of discussion. The third one, similar, but this is a different kind of intensity. And that is remembering the evidence and distinctions to make in the midst of a challenging conversation, specifically with a skeptic. Perhaps where I'm being attacked. And so this is a challenge where, it's coming at me and it's not friendly. Possible. It might be friendly, it might be a friendly person, but it might not be friendly. The fourth one then is navigating the conversation wisely. What do I mean by that? Well, not just telling them what you believe, but maybe understanding the person you're talking to. And this level can be navigated well, even if you're not as sharp as you would want to be on the first 3. And that's something that's really interesting when we understand our skills in asking questions and things where I can navigate this even though I might not know a whole lot of information on what the topic is of discussion and how I can interact. And so it takes time and it takes experience to develop confidence in those first 3 levels. It takes a lot of time. You got to be interested to keep your motivation. And really the amount of time it takes on those first 3 can be the biggest challenge, where it's just, this is a deterrent, and there's so much. But today I'm just going to talk about the 4th level within this discussion. So that's the one we're talking about, whether it's asking hard questions or challenging us. But rather than focusing on specific answers, I'm more talking about what to do, what not to do, within a discussion on a more strategic level. So I want to discuss 5 common mistakes that I've observed over the years. Within conversations, within online discussions as you observe it, within videos and even sermons. You see things and you go, oh, I don't know if that's the way to do that. So, first one of 5 common mistakes. Circular reasoning might be a little bit familiar. And this occurs when we make a statement and then the follow-up questions begin. We assert something, here comes a follow-up question, and our explanation ends up bringing us back around to where we started with our first statement. Most of us have done this. An example would be when someone defines a word and they use the word in the definition. You go, oh, that didn't help me. I'm still wondering what it meant. I remember doing this in high school. I didn't know I was doing circular reasoning, but I had one conversation with a friend. It's the only one I had. I'll tell you why. So we started this conversation, and I was doing this. I was doing circular reasoning. I'm like, well, because the Bible, I believe because it says so. And I was feeling like I knew less of what I was talking about than before I started, by the end of it, right? I was like, this is terrible. I'm like embarrassing God. And I decided I never want to talk about that again. The conversation was about the Bible. So I'm like, I'm not going to talk about the Bible. I just need to, let that go and not be saying stupid things. Because I feel dumber after I had the conversation. And what I didn't know is I was doing circular reasoning. So there's another solution. Rather than just not talking about it, is just figure out what that is and don't do it. So we've reached that level. Here's a little example of it. And when it comes to within the Christian faith, but it can happen with any religion that has a book. And we say, in our case, the Bible is God's word, and a simple question, follow up, well, why would you believe that? Well, because it says so. Okay, but why believe what it says? Well, because it's God's word, of course. Duh. And then they're like seeing the problem, and I go, that's what I was asking you about. And you say, well, I get that, but that's not what I was asking. You're not answering my question. So let's just not do it. Because the circle, when this happens, then the circle's been completed, and as we end up back where we started, and the skeptic sees the problem immediately. It's very clear to them, because they're the one asking the question, and they're the one realizes their question hasn't been answered. And probably we won't feel that confident about it ourselves anyway. And after hearing this a few times, though, what happens is will stop asking the question. And they give up the possibility of the Bible even making any sense. They say, well, it's clear that there's no answer to this. Because it's happened 3 or 4 times. They're like, well, I'm tired of that answer. I'm not going to keep asking. So, next one. This is a big one. But not answering the question asked. So there's often a temptation. There's often a temptation to talk about what we want to discuss, rather than what they're interested in. But think about this. When someone asks an honest question, what does that tell us about them? Well, it reveals what's of interest to them. So it's important not to overlook that. Be like, okay, well, I know you want to know about this, but I want to talk about something else. And it's granted, there might be other things you know are more important. Yes, okay, I know that's a fair question, but this other stuff's more important. Okay. And in the big picture, you realize that, but they don't know that. They don't know that yet. And if we respond to their actual question or their concern, if we don't respond to their actual question or concern, well, what does that communicate? It communicates, well, what they're interested in doesn't really matter to us. I don't want to talk about what's interesting to you. I want to talk about what's interesting to me. And so we can end up avoiding the question. Another way we might avoid it is redirecting with something that looks something like, well, that's interesting, but what really matters is, or, oh, there are lots of tough questions like that. But what you really need to understand is, and they go on to something else. And they're like, how are we talking about this? I've never even thought about this. And of course, the thing you're talking about is important. But all of it's important. So, there's an opportunity before us to discuss our faith, and we shouldn't take that for granted. And so encouragement here is they realize it's wonderful that they're bringing up any question at all. That's wonderful. Let's talk about it. So that whatever the question that they brought up, that's worth our time. And so what happens though then is if we address their question, it allows them to actually become interested in hearing more. Because if your response is interesting, you're like, okay, well, I have another question. Or now you want to ask them a question and they're open to it and they find the conversation interesting because it was interesting what you had to say. And so that's all coming from taking their question seriously. But another thing though is, of course, the common problem here is the reason people divert the question is often because we don't know the answer. But instead of being honest and just saying, well, I don't know, I haven't thought about that, we'll identify something else to talk about. But really, in reality, we should just say, well, I don't know, I'm not sure. Or I should follow up and say, well, let me look into that. That's a good question. Guess what? You get to learn something too. So saying I don't know isn't worth avoiding. In fact, it's a really good skill. And the final point I'm going to make on this one, to act like a point of discussion that they have interest in, to act like that's not worthwhile, even though it's not the most important thing, it doesn't magically make them interested in what you want to talk about. Well, suddenly they're going to want to know what I have to say. No, that's something that's going to grow. So rather we're taking the time to value their interests and address their questions and with meaningful insights, that's often going to perk their interest in the things that you know are really going to make a difference. Number 3, not agreeing whenever possible. Skeptics often make good points. They really do when you listen. Because they usually aren't making things up. They actually will quote Christians. Mm-hmm. Things Christians have said, or they might have video evidence. Right? So I had an opportunity years ago to attend a skeptics conference, and I was asked to do a debate with the atheist guest. And I went for majority of the day, and I got to go to some conference like sessions and seminars, and listen to even a comedian making fun of Christians. And honestly, I agreed with a lot of the things they had to say. I was like, yeah, that's funny. And other things in the session, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's a good point. That's why we don't do that. But there's people that do, and that's all. Like it's like picking out a politician. You find a video of one politician on the other side saying something crazy. Well, that's what they're doing with Christians, right? They're like, well, you look at this one pastor, look what he said. And then now we have a conference session about it. So, but my point is, there's a lot of reasonable points they made in critiquing Christians, and things that I might have had a similar critique of. And why? Because Christians have said and done a lot of dumb things. A lot of them. Mm-hmm. So when someone points it out, the best thing to do is just agree. Say, yep, that's crazy. That is ridiculous. There's no reason to say that. I'm not going to be offended by it. Just agree. Because we're a Christian because of Jesus, right? Not because of this other stuff. And they're not attacking Jesus usually. You might notice. If you pay attention, you're like, they're not really going after Jesus very much. They're going after all this other stuff. So, the things that Christians do and say aren't the problem that's gonna sway us. It actually might be evidence that God's right about us. And that's the way I think is a really good way to spin that and realize, okay, here's what really this is. This is evidence God's right. So it makes no sense to disagree with someone if they're saying something correct and making a good observation. And then it ends up fostering credibility with that person. Because they're talking to you, you're like agreeing with them. When they think they're making a good point, you agree with it, you get credibility. They're like, okay, you agree. Okay, good. You're not some crazy Christian, right? You just jumped a hurdle probably with them. I'll give you an example. One discussion I had with a student when I was in Oregon State. And I'd been working with a student in class, and she wanted to have a discussion with one of her housemates, a friend who was adamantly opposed to Christianity. And the conversation finally happened, and so we got there, and she expressed she didn't want to offend us with her comments because she's not very charitable. And we said, that's fine, promise, we won't get offended. So she goes on to express her problems with Christians, with organized religion, with the church especially. And after she shared all her observations and how it all bothered her, we just simply replied to her that we basically agree. Maybe there's one thing that I would have took issue with, or I'm not going to go into that. Yeah, we basically agree. And that response was perplexing to her. And you can see her face. Like, what? And finally she follows up and says, if you agree with me, then why are you still Christians? Good question. Because the answer is straightforward, and it comes down to just two things. First, all these objections about Christians and the church actually prove the point that we are all sinful and need Jesus. And because we're a mess and we made a mess of the world. So we share that. And then second, it's because of Jesus that we're believers. These objections have to do with what people have said and done. That's not a problem for Jesus. It tends to prove him right, actually. Now, did she accept Jesus then? No. That'd be surprising. But a door was open for her to start looking at things differently. And she was surprised and goes away from that with a completely different perspective. And it's because the credibility was established with her, and that we were acknowledging that she's making some good and worthwhile observations. And that allowed us to then answer some more important questions that she raised. So, number 4. Not recognizing the person behind the question. Oh boy. Well, something precedes a person's question. Maybe it's confusion or something that doesn't make sense. But often it can be experiences which have left them in a place of pain or past hurt. If something doesn't make sense, it'd be important to know why it doesn't make sense to them. So, in the same way, their questions come from a place of disappointment, it comes from a place of past hurt. And that's something you want to know if you're having that conversation. Or if it's just coming from confusion, you want to know that. And it's going to guide you. But knowing what is perceived the question or objection a person has, it might make a difference how you respond, and it allows you to have the wisdom, or as we've mentioned, like to be winsome in your response. But that requires us to ask some questions and not just talk ourselves, right? Actually ask questions, get them talking, hear where they're coming from. And it's taking the time to ask those questions about them is going to be essential to understanding who they are. And that leads right into the fifth one. And this fifth one is to understand the barrier the person is experiencing. So this relates to the previous one. It's like the next aspect of it, next step. So as we understand where a person's question is coming from, the next thing we want to identify is the barrier they're experiencing. And there's three primary barriers that people are dealing with. First one, you can see there's emotional, and then secondly, intellectual barriers, and third, willful barriers. Now, if you don't identify at least the category where the person is experiencing objections to Christianity, then you won't know if you're even talking in the right category. Or if you're talking about anything that would make a difference. So the emotional category pertains to pain they may experience, perhaps due to tragedy in their life, perhaps due to past hurts, experiences in the church, right? Getting a bad taste of Christianity. Those are things you want to know. Maybe it's an intellectual category, which would pertain to rational questions, which are natural things, but they wonder about things that maybe keep them from giving Christianity a serious consideration. They're like, I really need an answer to that if I'm going to take this serious. The willful category is a little different, because it has to do with, generally, stubbornness and pride. Often seen in like an unwillingness to change their life, or to admit a need for God, or even to consider that they might be wrong about things. Those are more difficult, because what do you do? Because it gets really complicated. And especially gets complicated if someone's got multiple categories going on. And you're like, well, this is going to take a decade sometimes. But the willful category, that's definitely most difficult, because it's tough to know where even to go. Because there isn't a question, there's not a specific experience. You're like, where do we even start? And scolding them about their stubbornness isn't going to get you anywhere. And it'll end the conversation. Pretty much guaranteed. But with the first two barriers, it's helpful to know which one they're experiencing, because I don't want to be talking about emotional aspects when their thought is this Christian faith is nonsensical. And in the same way, I don't want to be giving logical reasoning or going through the Lord, liar, lunatic argument when they're experiencing pain and distrust of the church. It's not going to help. So it's about really understanding, who am I talking to? But again, this requires asking questions, gathering information about the person, their background, whether it be with faith or with a religion and experience in the church, and then seeing what is revealed through that. Okay. So, a worthwhile goal with this is, once we've talked for a while and identified the barrier, as well as the significant objections they have, the opportunity comes to inquire specifically about what bothers them the most, and about Christianity. And so this goal that it's really helpful to have in mind, well, I want to get to where I could maybe ask them what really keeps them from considering Christianity. So once I identify a barrier, I can ask them about, within that barrier, what is the key thing that really makes you like not consider this and not even think about it or want to think about it. So you're looking for one or two things, which then can be the focus of our conversation. So if we can address the questions people actually have, identify the right barrier, and then the key obstacle within that barrier, our conversations are going to be effective interactions. With all that of the win. I want to give one example of this. And it was the same girl that wanted to go talk with her housemate, interestingly. And I had her in class. We went through 8 weeks of apologetics class in 1 quarter. And on the 8th week, after being quite the skeptic all the way through and questioning just about everything I said, we were talking after class, and finally I said to her directly, I said, in light of all the things that have bothered you, what bothers you the most? Of all the things, what bothers you the most of all this? She says, 2 things, like right away, like she didn't have to think about it. Notice this is not our first conversation, right? I'm not talking about that's a first conversation thing, but okay, as we're building rapport, I'm like, all right, well, of all these things, what bothers you the most? And she says, 2 things. And after identifying them, we talked about one. In about 90 seconds, she was like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I said, you got 1 left. And she starts to explain it. I'm like, what is it? I'm interested. She starts explaining it, and I don't understand, honestly. Because the first one was in the intellectual category, and this was in the emotional category. And I was like, I don't really know. I don't even really know what you're saying. It was hard to understand. And that's fine. And it just required her talking with some other people, specifically another Christian that had introduced her to this whole thing in this class, and so they got to talk. And we don't have to be involved in all of it, but the point is, that may require a discussion with somebody else, but now we're talking about the issue that really matters, that makes the difference. The stuff that's actually going to get us somewhere, that's in the way. We're addressing the right thing. So if we can address the questions they actually have, again, find the right barrier, find that obstacle, we're going to be effective. The other person is likely to think that it's interesting as well if you're talking about the things that fit the thing that they're concerned about. And one last thing, we don't have to get to everything we want to talk about all at once. Talk about what they want to. Yes, we know there's important things we want to talk about, but I understand that that's not today. That's down the line. I know where I want to get to, sure. But I've seen so many times people are like, well, I didn't talk about this, and I didn't talk about that, and I feel like I'm just screwing up. Because you didn't talk, what did you talk about? Well, that's great. Then you hear them say what they did talk about. That's a great conversation. You have to think about it. Like, no, the fact that you're having a conversation, this is fantastic. A wonderful thing. And what we're hoping for is another conversation. But if you think about it, I think this is what I'm talking about is helpful for us to be free from second guessing our conversations. You're like, oh, I didn't do this, or I should have done that. And it's like, you're doing something. You're engaged, you're doing great. And we're doing the right things. And then we can leave it to God and allow Him to use that conversation to tug at their heart.